The rim of the sunken ring was smooth. That was the detail Weth Cavell had noticed first, 11 years ago on his first day inside the Gaveth Grand Assembly. Every other platform in the chamber had edges built for something, grooves for tools, lips for documents, rails where delegates rested their limbs during long procedural stretches. This one had nothing. The rim curved inward, deliberate and clean. Nothing could be said on it. Nothing was meant to. The Gaveth Assembly was in session. 218 species occupied the elevated platforms above. The human ring, sunk 2.1 meters below the main floor grade, held 4 people. It had been holding fewer and fewer for 31 years. Weth was not in the ring. He sat in the archive observer bay, one level up and to the left, where the session record ran on a narrow screen, and the lighting was dim enough that nobody looked at him directly. He had a clear line of sight to all 19 ceiling support struts. He was on strut 14. No response from the human ring, no movement, no sound at all. That was not quite right, there was sound. Presiding Arbiter Druvensal Akarath was speaking. His vibration membranes ran along the length of his thorax, and when they moved, the tone they produced landed in the ears of other species as something slightly above them. Not the words, the tone. Other species processed it as faintly condescending regardless of what was being said. Weth had tested this theory over 11 years and could not find a single exception. Druvensal was on the second paragraph of his ruling. Below in the sunken ring, Lena Dorvas sat with a cloth-wrapped bundle resting beside her left knee, a cup of water she had poured and not touched, and a battered field notebook open across her palm. She was writing something. Weth had never been able to read it from his angle. He had tried, over the years, in the idle way you try things that don't matter but become a habit anyway. He could tell she was writing a number. That was all. Weth moved to strut 15, the part that still doesn't make sense. Nobody noticed the floor was gone until the ceiling started to shake. Stay close. 31 years earlier, Len had carried the same bundle into a room a great deal like this one. The bundle was lighter then, or maybe she was stronger. Hard to say, after 31 years, which one of those is true. The cloth was newer, at least, the weave not yet worn soft at the corners where her hands always gripped it. The room had been smaller. The Gaveth Assembly, at that point, was 53 years old and had recently expanded to include its 140th member species. It considered itself young enough to be generous and old enough to know better than to rush. Humanity had submitted its first observer status petition 8 months prior. The review period had taken 6 months. The ruling had taken 4 minutes. Len had ordered water. She poured it. She did not drink it. She had sat very still while the denial was read into the record, and when it was done, she had written one line in the field notebook and closed it and left the room at the same pace she had entered it. Not hurrying, not pausing. Weth had not been there for the first petition. He had been 19, finishing his archival certification on a relay station 2 systems away, not yet employed by the Terran Continuance Bureau, not yet assigned to the Gaveth sessions. He knew about the first petition the way he knew about most things from before his time here, from the records. He had read it 12 times. He knew the denial rationale word for word. He knew what cognitive variance profile meant in Gaveth administrative language because he had looked it up, and it meant roughly what it sounded like. By the time Weth arrived, the petitions had reached number 6. He had been on strut 3 on his first day, new to the room, still surprised by the ceilings. The ceilings were 38 meters high. He had not expected that. He had expected a working chamber, functional, scaled for practical use. What he found instead was a space engineered for one specific effect. Standing on the floor of the human ring on his first morning, he had looked up, and the ceiling had been so far away that for a moment he felt the floor shift under him. Not physically, just the sense of it. He had started counting struts that day. It helped. The current session, the 14th petition, had been scheduled for 3 hours. The denial took 4 minutes. Druvensal did not simply deny. That had been Weth's first and most durable observation about the Arbiter. He taxonomized. Every denial was a classification exercise. Humanity's petition was not rejected on merit. It was categorized. This year, the category was Cognitive Variance Profile Presenting Structural Integration Risk. Last time it had been procedural adaptation lag across multi-species consensus frameworks. The year before that, something about temporal processing asymmetries in high-stakes diplomatic contexts, which Weth had spent 2 weeks trying to find in any standard xenosociological index, and had eventually concluded Druven Sal had invented on the day. The floor clerk, a small, fast-moving species with 6 articulated fingers on each hand, echoed each ruling back in formal register immediately after Druven Sal spoke it. This was standard Vorin conclave procedure. The echo was not a confirmation. It was a decoration. It told the room that what had just been said was now twice as official as it had been 30 seconds ago. The elevated galleries received the denial with the quiet, calibrated attention of species that had been full members long enough to forget what the waiting felt like. Weth noted the broadcast timestamp and wrote nothing. In the adjacent observer ring, a shallower depression to the left of the human ring, separated by 4 meters of polished floor, the Moor delegates sat in a pressure suit. The Moor were aquatic. They required pressure suits in most assembly spaces. Their communication was bioluminescent, patterns of light across the surface of the suit, fast and precise. The session's translation equipment had never been configured to receive it. The Moor delegate had been producing light patterns throughout the session. Nobody in the elevated galleries had looked at them once. Druven Sal completed his ruling and moved to the remaining 2 hours and 56 minutes of scheduled session time, which he filled with procedural housekeeping, renewal of relay corridor licensing agreements, a scheduling note about the next multi-species infrastructure review, standard items, none of which required a vote, all of which required the session record to reflect that the arbiter had addressed them. Weth was on strut 17. Below him, Len finished writing whatever she had been writing. She closed the field notebook. She collected the cloth-wrapped bundle from beside her knee, tucked it under her arm, rose from the ring without looking at the elevated galleries, and walked to the floor clerk station at the base of the main dais. She set down a folded note, turned, left the hall at the same pace she had entered it, not hurrying, not pausing. The floor clerk looked at the note, then at the door, then back at the note, did not pick it up, did not read it, did not echo it. Weth completed his count, 19, and wrote it in his personal log, the one he had kept since his first session. He had filled 9 of these logs over 11 years. He had never told anyone what the strut counts were for. He was not entirely sure himself. It simply helped him think. He wrote, Session 14 petition denial logged. Lena Dorvas departed before session close, 14:07 assembly standard. Left folded note at floor clerk station. Note is not addressed to me. He paused, added struts 19, same as always. The following morning, the note was still on the floor clerk station. Weth logged its existence. 4 words visible through the fold. He did not open it. He did not touch it. He wrote down the 4 words in his personal log, and then he sat for a while with his notebook open, looking at the empty hall. The 4 words were, "We are going home." Relay coordination post-Dressenol was not on any Gavath sensor grid. This was not an accident. It was a repurposed atmospheric survey station, 6-person capacity, originally built to monitor radiation spikes in a system the Gavath Assembly had reviewed once and categorized as geologically stable. The categorization was correct. The monitoring station had therefore been considered redundant for the past 11 years. Nobody had come to decommission it because decommissioning required a filing required a review required an assigned officer, and the officer assigned to the geologically stable system had retired 9 years ago and had not been replaced because the position was considered non-critical. The Gavath Assembly was very good at this, at deciding, quietly and permanently, that certain things did not require attention. Len arrived at Dressenol via a relay junction that Gavath calibration had never formally mapped. The junction existed. It worked. It simply did not appear in any record that the assembly maintained. It appeared in the Dressenol document, on page 847, in a section titled Navigational Substrates, Kel-Amory Positional Frameworks. The section was 43 pages long. The The team was already there when she arrived. Dr. Asen Farethvel was standing at the room's one flat work surface, which was a fold-down panel barely wide enough for two people to lean over at the same time. She was a systems economist. She thought in dependency chains, if A then B, which meant C was wrong, which meant D had been producing incorrect outputs for some number of years, and that number was usually larger than the number anyone wanted to hear. She had worked with Len for 19 years. She had a habit of reading section headers aloud before beginning any briefing, which other people found methodical and Len had once described in the driest possible voice as ceremonial. The rationale document was open on the surface in front of her. Commander Brath Undvel sat against the far wall with his notebook open. He was the team's tactical lead, which in this context meant he was the person who had spent 19 years translating infrastructure data into something that resembled a plan. He was compact and very still, the kind of still that is not peace but control. In the cover of his notebook, pressed flat and slightly worn, was a transit permit from his first off-world posting. He had transferred it from notebook to notebook for 22 years. He could not have explained why if asked, so he had stopped asking himself. Rendareth sat at the room's single communications terminal. He was not typing. He had pulled up the relay junction map, the real one, not the assemblies, and was looking at it the way musicians look at a score before they play. He had memorized every active relay junction in the Gavath-adjacent network, not from records, from maintenance shifts and calibration runs, and 11 years of being in the places. The assembly sent technicians when things needed fixing and did not need crediting. No credit, no record, no audit. That was the summary of 31 years of human infrastructure work in assembly-adjacent space. Asen had put it more precisely in the document's introduction. The understory compact's contributions existed in no formal record because the assembly had developed, over 3 decades, a very clean system for categorizing them as background. Background did not require acknowledgement. Background did not require payment beyond the minimum transit and maintenance agreements that expired every 7 years and were renewed routinely, without review. Asen began reading the section headers aloud. Not for information. Everyone in the room had read the document many times. She read them the way Weth counted struts, because some things need to be spoken in a room before they are used. Relay maintenance coverage, atmospheric chemistry embeddings, navigational substrate contracts, emergency medical architecture update cycles. She read each one in the same flat voice, without emphasis, the way you read the names of the dead when the reading is the point and not the end of it. The room was quiet when she finished. The assembly has a word for the things we do, Asen said. The word is background. Nobody spoke. The document ran to 5,211 pages. It had taken 19 years to build. Not one page had ever been shared with the assembly, not from oversight, from decision, from the understanding, reached very early in the process, that a document shown too soon is a document the other side learns to answer. A document kept until the moment it is needed is something else. Weth was not in that room. He would read Asen's session log 3 days later, sitting in the archive bay at Nelvar Station in the dim light with the empty hall below him. He would read it twice. Then he would open his personal log, think for a long time, and write, Struts, 19. The room is the same. The floor has already been decided. Len set the bundle on the fold-down surface and did not open it. Commander Brath Undvel stood, laid a second document flat beside Asen's thinner, printed on a material that did not come from any assembly-affiliated source, and began with a number. 47, he said. That was the count of denial hearings the Gavath Assembly had conducted involving species that now formed the understory compact. Not just humanity's 14, all 10 species, across all proceedings, across 31 years. 47 times a chamber like the one at Nelvar Station had determined that someone in this room was not worth the mathematics. The document Brath had laid down was not a capabilities inventory. It was a perception record. What the Assembly had said about each compact species, in official rulings, in session transcripts, in interblock communications that the compact had obtained through means Brath preferred to describe simply as patient. What language had been used? What categories had been invented? The Dravathi network had been described as procedurally unsuited to real-time consensus frameworks because their communication via spore-chemical pulse was slow. The translation for Dravathi deliberation ran at roughly 1/5 the pace of standard assembly procedure. What the assembly had categorized as a developmental limitation was, Brath noted, the same mechanism that allowed the Dravathi to carry colonial memory across generations without data loss. Their network had been building infrastructure in the outer relay systems since before the Gavath assembly had a name. The Moore Collective had been described in 3 separate rulings as communication incomplete. Their bioluminescent language had no entry in the assembly's translation database. Their atmospheric chemistry patents, 22 of them, embedded in active Gavath life support systems across 11 worlds, were listed in assembly records as auto-maintained background infrastructure, source unlisted. Source unlisted. Weth had read that phrase in the document and had felt something in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief. He had written it in his personal log and underlined it twice, which he had never done before in 11 years of logs. 47 times, Brath said. 47 times someone in that room decided none of us were worth the mathematics. We did the mathematics anyway. He sat back down. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Outside, through the small port window, the relay junction they had come in on was dark and still. Elder Runvel of the Dravathi joined via chemical pulse relay at 09:14 Dresinol local time. The translation equipment in the post was good, better than anything in the assembly sessions, which had never been calibrated for Dravathi communication in the first place. Still, the translation ran slow. Asen had set a small indicator light on the terminal that pulsed when a translation was still processing. The team had learned to watch for it. When the light pulsed, they waited. Runvel's pauses were not dead air. They were the last part of the message. Runvel had been in contact with the Terran Continuance Bureau for 18 years. Not through formal channels. The Dravathi had no formal standing in assembly proceedings, which meant formal channels did not apply. Through records. She had spent 18 years reading Terran operational records. Not history, not political archives, but the working documents, maintenance logs, framework update cycles, relay calibration schedules, atmospheric chemistry audit reports. The kind of records that institutions keep and never look at. She had emerged from that reading with one observation. She had shared it with no one outside the compact. The translation indicator pulsed for a long moment, and then the output printed. They have been doing this since before we knew to watch. The room did not react. This was not the kind of statement that warranted a reaction. It was the kind of statement you let sit, the way you let weight-bearing material sit before you test it. Runvel continued. The translation came in pieces, each one arriving after the light had pulsed its way to conclusion. She had spent 3 years cross-referencing Terran maintenance records with Dravathi infrastructure logs from the outer relay systems. The overlap was not incidental. In 4 systems, Terran technicians and Dravathi network operatives had been maintaining the same relay junctions from different access points, on different schedules, without ever formally meeting, because neither of them appeared in the assembly's records as existing in those systems at all. They had been working in parallel for decades without acknowledgement from either direction. A species that maintains what it was never thanked for maintaining, the translation read, is not a species that is waiting for permission. It is a species that has already decided. Len had been watching the translation indicator throughout. She had not written anything in the field notebook during the entire meeting. Weth had noted this later, reading the session log. Not one word. Her pen was in her hand. She had not used it. She had spent 11 years learning the exact dimensions of the room at Nelvar Station. She had spent 20 learning the dimensions of what the room was built on top of. Rendareth opened a blank message field at 09:47 Dresinol local time. 1 line, 2 words. The team watched him type. Nobody spoke. The relay junction map was still on his screen behind the message field, All the junctions the assembly had never formally mapped, all the routes that existed because someone had gone out and built them without being asked. He typed the 2 words. He did not look up when he hit send. "Come home." The message went simultaneously to every human technician, advisor, and contractor across 6-star systems. Every understory compact operative in the network received it in the same moment, through relay paths that did not appear in any assembly-maintained record. The send timestamp was logged at rationale, not at Nelvar Station, not at any address the assembly had on file. The timestamp read 09:47:12. The clock at Nelvar Station read 09:47:12 also. Weth would note this later when he pulled the relay logs. The synchronization was exact. He wrote it down without comment. 3 species from the understory compact did not respond immediately. Brath had anticipated this. He had not told the others he had anticipated it, because anticipating it did not change it, and the waiting would be the same either way. He kept his notebook open. The transit permit in the cover was pressed flat, same as always. The 3 species were the Calamari, the Vesindre, and a small collective called the Ilith, who had joined the compact 11 years ago after the assembly had denied their observer petition on the grounds that their non-fixed territorial structure did not meet the definition of a coherent governance body. The Ilith had 17 relay junctions under active maintenance at that point. None of the junctions were in their territory. All of them were in systems the assembly considered strategically significant. The Calamari had trade corridor access pending review. The Vesindre had an environmental certification in process, a 2-year process that had been running for 4 years. The Ilith had nothing pending. The Ilith had stopped filing with the assembly 6 years ago, after the 5th petition denial, and had simply kept working. Asen had the dependency maps open. She was not reading them. She had the numbers memorized. Elder Runevel's translation indicator pulsed twice, then cleared. The output printed slowly. "I will read to them." She read from a Terran historical record. Not one Weth knew, not a political document, not a founding text. A maintenance log from a relay station in the Karath system, 61 years old. The record had been kept by a technician named Soren Calvet, who had worked alone on the station for 3 years and had recorded every calibration run, every junction test, every atmospheric check. The log contained no political statements, no manifestos. It contained measurements, dates, a note near the end that the backup atmospheric monitor was running 12% below optimal, and he had ordered a replacement 3 months ago, and it had not arrived, and he was compensating manually. The translation ran for 11 minutes. The Calamari confirmed at the end of the 6th minute. The Vesindre confirmed at the end of the 9th. The Ilith had confirmed before Runevel finished reading. Their message contained 4 words beyond the confirmation itself. "We already knew this." Brath wrote down the timestamps. He did not say anything. Len looked at the bundle on the fold-down surface for a moment. Then she reached over and untied it. The cloth fell open. Inside was a single document in a protective sleeve, the original observer status designation from humanity's first petition, 31 years old. The paper was Gaveth administrative issue, standard weight, standard format. The denial rationale was printed in Gaveth administrative green, the color used for rulings that required no further review. She set it face up on the table. The denial rationale read, in part, cognitive variance profile presents structural integration risk in high consensus institutional frameworks. Nobody in the room said anything. Asen looked at it for a long moment and then looked away. Brath adjusted the transit permit in his notebook cover, an old habit, checking that it was still there. Ren Dareth was already back at the terminal, pulling relay status feeds. Len folded the cloth around the sleeve again, set it back beside her. The document had served its purpose. It had needed to be in the room. Asen began the timeline at 10:31. She had been calling it the collapse timeline in her own notes for 2 years, but she did not use that word in the room. She used transition sequence. The word collapse implied something unintended. This was not unintended. Day 1, All human technicians and Terran Continuance Bureau personnel began orderly withdrawal from assembly-adjacent relay systems. No disruption, no announcement, standard end-of-contract procedure, applied simultaneously across all 6 systems. Day 1 also, all understory compact maintenance personnel, Dravathi, Kelamari, Moor, Vesendre, and the remaining 6 compact species began the same process. Parallel withdrawal, coordinated but not announced. The coordination was in the rationale document. Everything was in the rationale document. Day 19, relay degradation in the outer systems would become detectable. Not catastrophic, the relays were built to last, but the small errors would begin. The calibration drift that human technicians corrected every 43 days would go uncorrected. The atmospheric chemistry checks that Moor personnel ran on 11 life support systems would not run. Day 34, jump junction rerouting in the Caverith corridor would fail. The corridor carried cargo traffic for 4 assembly member systems. It would not fail completely, there were redundant routes. The redundant routes would take longer. The cargo would still arrive. Day 61. Grain distribution for 3 colony systems would fall below stable threshold. The shortfall would not be catastrophic. The colonies had reserves. The reserves were calculated for 40 days. Day 40 was not day 61. Day 91. The medical response framework on a Voran colony world, a framework that Terran emergency teams had updated and maintained for 9 years. Under a contract the assembly renewed every 7 years without review, would encounter a containment situation it was not equipped to handle alone. The framework had a 14-day window for containment. Without the update cycle that Terran teams had been running, the window would close 14 days late. The colony would be fine. Eventually, Weth would read this section of the session log 4 times. He would not write anything in his personal log after the 4th reading. He would sit in the archive bay at Nelvar Station in the dim light and count struts. He would get to 19. He would not start again. At day 47, a researcher at an independent Xenolinguistic Institute in the Sarath system ran the Moor delegates' bioluminescent output through an independent translation system, not the assembly system, an academic system built to handle non-standard communication formats, used primarily for per-contact fieldwork. The researcher had been given a recording of the Moor delegates' patterns from the last 11 years of assembly sessions, obtained through an archive request that had taken 8 months to process. The translation took 6 hours. The output was 3 sentences long. We are able to assist with the relay degradation in sectors 4 through 9. We have been watching the calibration drift for 7 years. When do you need us to stop? That was it, 3 sentences. The same 3 sentences, repeated in pattern variation, not different messages, but the same message rendered through bioluminescent syntax in 11 different ways across 11 years of sessions. Because the Moor communication protocol treated an unanswered message as a message that needed resending in a different form. They had been asking the same question at every session for 11 years. A question, the same question, 11 years of the same question, and nobody had ever been listening. The researcher filed the translation as a footnote to a paper on non-standard assembly communication formats. The paper was published. It did not circulate widely. Weth found it in the archive feeds 14 days later and sat very still for a long time before he wrote anything. He wrote they were not silent, the room was. He underlined it once. Then he opened his personal log and counted struts from memory for the first time outside a session. He was not in the chamber. He was at his station in the Nelvar archive bay, 3 corridors from the hall. He counted from memory the visual map of the ceiling he had built over 11 years, strut by strut. He got to 19. He stopped. He wrote, the room is the same size it has always been. Day 94. The Gavith Grand Assembly convened an emergency continuity session. 9 relay networks carried the broadcast. Every active assembly member was present. The attendance record logged 218 species on elevated platforms above the main floor. Full attendance. The presiding arbiter's call went out at 12:03 Assembly Standard. By 12, 05 the hall was in session order. The human ring was empty. Not sealed, not barricaded. No formal closure had been filed, because filing a formal closure required the species in question to submit the filing, and the species in question had submitted nothing. The ring was simply empty. The smooth rim caught the hall lighting exactly as it always had, the same curve, the same deliberate inward slope, designed so nothing could rest on it. Weth was in the archive observer bay. He counted struts. He got to 14. He started again. Elder Runevell was present as an understory compact observer, not a petitioner, not an applicant, an observer. It was the first time in the Assembly's history that an understory species had attended a session without an application pending. There had been no procedural precedent for how to log her attendance. Weth had checked. He had logged her as observer, non-member, understory compact, status, present. It was the most accurate thing he could write. Druven Sal called for the session to open. His floor clerk echoed it back. The echo lasted longer than usual. Runevell's statement came during the third procedural item. She did not raise a point of order. She simply spoke, and because she was present as an observer and had been listed in the session record, and because Druven Sal's clerk had logged her as recognized observer status, the session record was required to include it. The translation ran slow. The room waited. The question assumes the crisis is new. The infrastructure was always theirs. You simply never asked what that meant. Druven Sal's formal continuity request to the Terran Continuance Bureau was logged at 14:32 Assembly Standard. Weth logged the timestamp. He continued counting. 19. He started again. At Relay Coordination Post Rationale, Len was eating. Plain food, the kind you make when you are not thinking about what you are making. A grain dish, standard field rations, the type that comes in a sealed packet and tastes exactly like it looks. She had a small screen propped against the wall and was reading a relay status report. The message from Druven Sal arrived at 14:32. She read it. She finished eating. She set the plate to one side. She picked up a pen. The cloth-wrapped bundle was on the surface beside her. The cup of water she had poured when she sat down was untouched. She wrote for 2 hours and 14 minutes. The reply was handwritten. Cloth fiber paper, not standard issue, the material that assembly staff had always found slightly difficult to file because cloth fiber did not feed cleanly through the standard document processing equipment. This was not accidental. The paper had a texture. It held ink differently. It required a person to hold it, not a machine to process it. Runevell, Asen, Brath, Wren, they were all at Rationale by then. Nobody had suggested staying. Nobody had suggested leaving. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when everyone in them understands that the thing they have been building for a very long time is now complete. Len set the pen down. She looked at what she had written for a moment. Then she signed it, folded it, and handed it to Ren Darath, who sealed it and transmitted it through the relay junction that did not appear in any assembly record. At 16:46 Assembly Standard, addressed formally to presiding arbiter Druven Sal Akarath of the Gavath Grand Assembly. The reply was 7 sentences long. The index ran to 5,211 pages. The Terran Continuance Bureau and Understory Compact acknowledge receipt of the continuity request dated day 94. Assembly Standard. We are prepared to discuss resumption of infrastructure maintenance and relay support under revised terms. The terms are outlined in the attached document. We recommend beginning with the relay maintenance section. The atmospheric chemistry section may require additional time. The medical framework section is marked urgent. We are available to begin discussion at your earliest availability. The floor clerk looked at it. They called for the session to continue. They called it. The call went out. Nobody echoed it back. The floor clerk looked at the reply again. They looked at the elevated galleries. They looked at Druven Sal. Druven Sal called for the session to continue a second time. The procedural record, for the first time in 22 years of assembly sessions, showed no outcome entry. The session did not continue. It did not formally close. It simply stopped producing entries. Runevell had read the records. Asen had mapped the dependencies. Len had signed the message. The floor had already left. Weth, in the archive observer bay, wrote the timestamp. He noted that the floor clerk had not returned to their station after the second call. He noted that the echo chair was empty. He wrote it down. He did not know what it meant yet. The recorded annex at the Dakar sublevel held 11 years of Weth's work. Not session records, those were in the main archive. The annex held the other records. The ones he had pulled from maintenance logs, framework update cycles, relay calibration sheets, medical archive update receipts, atmospheric chemistry audit signatures. The names at the bottom of those records. People who had been in the right place at the right time for decades without once appearing in the session transcripts. He had started compiling them in his second year. He had not told anyone. The wall was floor to ceiling. The names ran in columns, standard type, no formatting. 2,847 names. Some had been dead for years before Weth found their records. Some were still working. Some had gone home already. He had checked the recall logs. Len came in at 09:11 the following morning. She did not comment on the wall. She stood in front of it for a while, reading. Weth watched her eyes move across the columns. She read the way she did everything completely, without hurrying. He asked her whether she thought the assembly would offer full membership now. She was quiet for a moment. She had the Dressenol index in her hand, the physical copy, the one she had carried back from Dressenol in the cloth-wrapped bundle, tucked in beside the original denial. She was reading it again, not for information, because some things need to be read again after they have been used, the same way Asen read section headers aloud before a briefing. The membership was never the architecture, she said. She turned a page. The architecture was always the floor. We just stopped maintaining it for free. She did not say anything else. She kept reading. Weth turned back to the wall. The ceiling in the annex was lower than the session hall, 12 meters, not 38. He had never counted the struts here. There were 4 plain functional supports, nothing designed for effect. He had never felt the need to count them. He wrote in his personal log, "A ceiling, unsupported, is just a very slow collapse." The hall at Nelvar Station still has 38 meters of it. What it no longer has is the floor. The light in the annex was even and flat, the kind that does not cast shadows in one direction more than another. The names on the wall did not look like a monument. They looked like what they were, a list of people who had showed up and done the work. Weth stood in front of them. He put his hands in his pockets. He stood there for a long time.